Well, for more on the aftermath of Hurricane Milton, we are joined now by Daniel Kreeger. He's Executive Director and co-founder of the Association of Climate Change Officers, which focuses on climate change challenges. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So how, Daniel, do you think Florida has fared in the wake of Milton? Despite this widespread damage, the governor says this was not the worst-case scenario.
You know, I think one of the stories down the road that will be told, notwithstanding how devastating the impacts of this storm have been, is that people actually heeded the preparedness warnings. So we saw a lot of people moving to shelters. We saw a lot of people getting out of harm's way. And if we make a comparison to some of what we see, say, for example, in North Carolina with Helene, where the damage is extraordinary, the preparedness was not. And I don't just mean the response in terms of getting away when the storm is coming. Frankly, I don't think anybody there realized just how bad it was going to be there. Whereas we had a bullseye marked on somewhere near Tampa and that whole Gulf Coast for several days. That's a major story in some of the response that's going to happen here.
So is that what makes the difference? Is that the critical factor there, that people really do need to heed the warnings and the state also needs to be prepared?
Well, yes, but across the board, and not just when the storm is coming, but in the design of critical infrastructure, in where we're siting and placing things, that we're planning for a world where these things are happening more often, more intensely. If we're designing and functioning as though that's the case, we're going to be better prepared to deal with that. And if we're acting as though, oh, this never happens, then we're going to get caught unprepared.
So what, in your assessment, how did the authorities do in the build-up to the storm and the aftermath?
So I think the communication at multiple levels of government on this, and with the media, with traditional media, has been really very sharp. An enormous number of people, and not just in the area, people around the world were hearing about this well beforehand. My girlfriend's Brazilian, her family and friends in Brazil were reaching out to her the day before because they were hearing about this. That's a credit to how much communication there was about this beforehand. So in that regard, great. Now, going forward, all of these systems at federal and subnational levels, at state and local, are going to be severely taxed because the range of area that has been impacted by these two storms is an enormous amount of the country and an enormous amount of this state. And there's only so many people, there's only so many dollars.
Interesting. So as we talk about the next phase, what can the private sector do to help with rescue, recovery, and rebuilding?
Well, so certainly reinvestment in the areas is going to be important, although smart reinvestment is going to be. This is a public-private partnership, honestly. And I think one of the things that we learned after Hurricane Andrew was the insurance industry in 1992 wasn't so excited about providing wind insurance here after Hurricane Andrew. The state of Florida had to stand up its own program, and a lot of people don't realize that. There's already, with climate change, a lot of skittishness in the lending industry and in the insurance industry in this state, and for good reason, quite frankly. So there's a partnership between public and private to invest, to design smart, to rebuild. That all needs to happen. And then in any community, whether it's public or private sector, we're all in this together. So everybody's going to have to carry an oar here and pitch in order to rebuild communities.
Even in this interview alone, Daniel, you've been bringing up Andrew, and we talked about Helene. What is the cumulative effect of having, well, first in this case, two back-to-back storms, but also just, a whole series of them really through the season?
Well, the cumulative effect is exactly just a massive challenge. And it's not just cumulative effect within the season. It's cumulative effect over years. So if you take a storm like Irma and the substantial damage that it caused to many of these same areas on the Gulf Coast, it takes years to rebuild a lot of this infrastructure. Some of it never really gets properly rebuilt. So now you've got more vulnerability. When you make that within a season, that's even worse. So some of the obvious part of that was we saw these piles of debris that hadn't been cleared that created projectile risk of things flying around at 100 plus miles an hour. That's the really obvious eyesore part of it that we consider as a risk. But the reality is you had structures that were damaged by flood that had not been fixed. You had critical systems that were not operating properly. Those things we haven't had time to recover, and now we just got hit again.